Well, we thought the reception, like you were staying here or something, so the reception had, and you were.
No, I was just
waiting
sitting out there waiting for you guys to come and get me.
Oh, fuck.
Yeah.
How long have you been
We
here?
fucked up.
Welcome back to What You'll Learn. My name is Adam Ashton.
My name is Adam Jones. We just had a great interview with Stephen Keane, but after a little slow start, we left him waiting for a while.
We did. This is our first in-person interview.
Live.
So yeah,
We fucked it at the start.
Yeah.
Left him waiting in the reception for
He
15
wasn't
minutes. But
happy.
anyway,
He wasn't happy, but we got there in the end.
yeah, we had an incredible interview after that. So, we go into property
Mm-hmm.
pretty detailed and what's to come in property. So, if you are, if your name's Sue and you're 30 years old and you've just bought a house and you're levered up to 90% debt,
Yeah.
get the fuck out.
Yeah.
Basically.
Even if your name's not Sue.
Yeah, that's mate Sue.
Yeah. Basically, we did his book, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? We can't. He said there's no hope.
Yeah.
The only hope is if the environment gets fucked and then we have to fight climate change. It's the only way out.
I guess the main takeaway, and which he goes into pretty deep, is that credit is the derivative of debt.
Yeah.
Stuff
As in
like
the
that.
change. No.
The change in debt, and
Yep.
once the derivative goes down,
Yep.
the acceleration of debt goes down, then there's
Yep.
all this money disappears from the economy,
Yeah.
and then once all the money disappears from the economy, we have a serious crash, and,
Yep.
and there's a lot of countries in the world right now who are in way too much debt, and there's
Yep.
only one way out, and
Yeah.
that's
Down.
down.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
crashed.
So that's spot on, mate. Yeah, there's a few economic terms that we try to slow down a little bit on, but mate, crash is coming.
Crash is
Protect yourself,
coming.
get
Smart.
out.
He's got a few solutions. Listen in, and he's got
Yep.
some advice
Yep.
for people as well. So I think there's a lot to learn from Steve Keane compared to a lot of the mainstream economists who are out there. So listen up, guys. Hope you enjoy it and learn as much as we did. We learned a hell of a lot. He's
Yeah.
fucking smart, this dude,
He knows his shit.
and he knows his shit. And yeah, enjoy.
It's not going to be a crash in the countries that crashed back in 2008.
Mhm.
So I divide the world into sort of there's three groups. There's what I call the walking dead of debt.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones who've already had a financial crisis by private debt dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
And that's mainly the USA, Japan, UK, and most of Europe. Then I call the zombies to be.
Mhm.
Those are countries which managed to get through the crisis in 2008 by
Mm.
continuing to borrow money. It's all private debt that I'm
Yeah.
talking about. So Australia's one of those. So is Canada, China, South Korea, Belgium, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, etc., etc. So they managed to avoid the crisis
Mhm.
by continuing to lever up. So they're rather than, like in Australia's case, they had about 180% of, on BIS figures, level of private debt in Australia was about 180% of GDP in 2008. It's now 213%.
Mm.
So there's been an increase in debt, and of course, because you borrowed that money and spent it into the economy, you've stimulated demand.
Mm.
But the only way to keep the economy from having a crash is to continue borrowing more money.
Nice.
And every country that's done that has reached a point where they get a peak level of debt, and either the banking system decides not to lend anymore,
Mhm.
or the borrowers stop borrowing. And when they do, that credit-based demand disappears and the economy crashes.
Nice.
So how much? You say Australia's got 213%, and there's in the book you say there's two ways to avoid the crash, and that's keep levering up and go
Yeah.
further into debt, or you crash out of it.
Mm.
So what is the tipping point you think where we'll actually fall out and potentially crash, and how long until that comes, you think?
Well, it's an internal process. It doesn't take an external trigger. Normally you'll get one because reserve banks, most reserve banks are completely ignorant of the role of credit in the economy.
Mm.
So they put up interest rates without realising they're going to coke off credit demand, and it collapses, and that's the trigger. Or APRA does its increased regulatory stuff, and that also stops the borrowing, and that's the trigger. But it can, because there's you can't actually say what the maximum level of debt a country can carry is. But the maximum any country has carried of household debt, for example, is roughly 140% of GDP. So if you then say, well, let's say it started from 20% of GDP and reached 140%, if you drove a time, what you get is like an S-shaped curve. Flat, takes off, levels out. That's debt. Okay. Credit is the annual change in debt. Okay. That's the slope of the line. Okay. Now your maximum level of credit is never this smooth. Okay. It's always much more irregular in the real world, but your maximum slope of that S curve is actually the halfway point. It's at the middle of the S. And that's when credit gives you the maximum amount of demand. As you start to stabilise towards the maximum level of debt, then that demand disappears. Now, if your economy is being relying upon demand from income, turnover of goods and services, plus credit, and suddenly credit goes zero, and the economy crashes for that reason alone. So I give the numerical example of the book on that front.
That's awesome.
I was just wanting a quick couple of, just to go back a step. So just in terms of some basic definitions. So debt, credit is the change in debt. They're definitely not interchangeable terms. And when you talk about private debt, I guess what's that made up of? That's individuals.
There's three major categories, but one of them is badly recorded in the data, so you can't really use it. There's non-financial corporation debt. So that's corporation like BHP, Unilever, that sort of thing. There's household debt, which is, you can break that down into secured debt, which is mainly mortgages, and then unsecured debt, credit cards and stuff like that. And the other is the financial sector debt. So you have non-bank financial institutions borrowing from banks. Okay, but the trouble is that particular data, the most detailed data on that is the American flow of funds data. And unfortunately, the way it's defined right at like the 8-digit level, they mix together borrowing by banks and borrowing by non-banks in exactly the same number. Like you've got a scrambled egg and you're supposed to. So I look at that. I used to use the financial sector data. I realize I simply can't use it. But if you look at it, if you look just at the non-financial corporate sector debt plus the household debt, then that, for any country more than 10 million people, so like a substantial economy, the maximum level that any country is carried is about 240% of GDP. Australia's currently at 210.
So I guess it's obvious after you read the book that you can't exponentially keep going into debt, and obviously it's something seems so simple, but the mainstream economists don't seem to get it. So I guess my question is, like, so what is actually the thing that's wrong with debt that the mainstream economists aren't getting?
What they're not getting is that credit actually increases demand. And see, that's what I do. The talk I gave today, and I've done dozens of YouTube videos where I do it. I show the model they have where banks intermediate. Banks don't create debt. That's the model. They talk about financial intermediaries. That's what they teach in the textbooks. And all these guys, if they believe this stuff, they swallow it and they regurgitate it without realising how significant it is. So Paul Krugman's a classic instance of that, for example. Now, if you intermediate between a saver and a borrower, then if the saver is going to lend to the borrower, the saver's cash has to fall. The borrower's cash rises. It's like a seesaw. The average height doesn't change. But when you say it's actually banks originate money, so banks create a debt and they create money at the same time, and you then use that money and buy something, that credit actually adds to demand. So like a lot of economics is telling people that what works at the individual level doesn't work at the aggregate. Okay? Ironically, this is one of the most important areas where what works at the individual level does work at the aggregate, because banks originate money. So like one of the illustrations I give is that if a group of people try to save money collectively, saving by one is precisely equal to fall in income by the others. Okay, so that's the case where the individuals can save but the collective cannot. But in this particular case, when you borrow money, because the bank is creating the money independently, your spending is the sum of your turnover of existing money plus your change in debt, and it aggregates to the national level as well. So when you look at that, you therefore see that if credit's running at 10 or 15 or 20% of GDP, it's been as high as 40% for some major developed countries. When that credit demand disappears, then something like 1/3 of the demand of the economy evaporates. Suddenly all the jobs people are relying upon for that are just gone, and that falls over so rapidly.
So I guess moving into property now, so you're saying that if people stop going into debt and then there's going to be less credit in the market, and is that specifically why the property might crash as well?
And that's what's happened in every country in the world. Australia continues encouraging people into mortgage debt. We now have the second highest level of household debt on the planet, and the only country that has more household debt than Australia is Switzerland, and Switzerland runs a trade surplus of about 10% of GDP. We've been running a deficit of about 5%. So that makes a big difference. They've got that buffer, which we don't have. Because effectively, when you run a trade surplus, you're outsourcing money creation. The rest of the world's creating your francs for you. In Australia's case, we're creating money for the rest of the world. as well as borrowing money. So the country that had the highest level of household debt before Australia, which also ran a trade deficit, was Ireland. And that peaked at 120% of GDP. It rose from 50, hit 120%, it's now 50 again. Boom, bang. Whereas Australia has still continued going up. And there are various tricks the government can use, and this is what I really do blame the government here. Normally I absolve the government. The politicians get the benefit of a booming credit market because that looks like a booming economy, and they can say they're being responsible managers running a surplus. In fact, what it means, they're taxing capital gains that are being financed by credit, and they therefore run a surplus. But the private sector is getting more and more into debt. And the private said, the household sector will keep on doing it if they believe house prices are going to continue rising. So everything the government does that encourages that keeps the bubble going. But you are getting to the point where Australia is, like I said, it's got more debt than any trade deficit country, household debt, than any trade deficit country has ever had. And it thinks it can keep on going. I don't think it can.
Well, you've definitely highlighted plenty of good arguments that say that it can't. So some of the zombies to be, so you said Australia, Canada, China, South Korea. What does it look like, I guess, to the people what happens when the crash eventually comes?
Well, effectively,
what will it look like?
if your credit demand is, say, running at like equivalent to 10% of GDP, which is small compared to what it was, America's 15% of GDP, suddenly you go from demand, which is like in America's case, you go from demand being 1.15 times GDP to 0.95 times GDP. So effectively 20% of demand disappears. Now most of that is borne by the asset markets. Because it was warned by the real economy, you've got a depression on your hands. Okay, so the asset markets normally collapse, and they collapse before the physical market does, because part of the trick about asset prices is that this is the supply and demand argument, but I've done it. I get so pissed off with people saying it's all about supply and demand. Demand supplies Richard, therefore prices rise. Waving their fucking hands around. So I decided to do the mathematics on this. And the basic idea is what is the physical flow of demand per year for housing? Well, it's fundamentally, at a very abstract level, it's fundamentally change in mortgage debt divided by the price level. That's how many houses can be purchased, standard houses can be purchased each year. The supply, on the other side, is a turnover of existing properties, which has got all sorts of factors behind it, plus new properties being created.
Sure.
So there's a fair bit of math in the actual argument, but the basic punchline is that because you've got a relationship between change in debt and the level of house prices, and there's a relationship between acceleration in debt and change in house prices. Now, when you do that S-curve thing, the maximum slope of the curve is the middle, but then that's you've got the level, okay, that's the rate of change. The acceleration is the slope of the little hill. Well, that maxes out even earlier. So what you find is that because the acceleration is what drive the house prices, the acceleration stops before everything else. And if you look at the American data, house prices were the rate of change of house prices was heading down as early as 2006. It took 2 years before the economy itself fell over. So that's why the asset markets go first. Okay.
So what do you say to, there was another podcast I used to listen to, Property Couch, before I started again on some of your work, and I remember on an episode they had a dig at you actually specifically. I don't know if you've heard of this, just because they're pro-property, but some of the things they say on it is like buy land close to the city as population growth. As the population grows, these assets become scarce, and then so forth. And in 7 years' time, you got the equity in this house. And then you retire at 40 years old, happily ever after, and you've got passive income. And a lot of my friends right now are taking this advice. So that's why I think your work's so important to get out there. So what would you say to them?
Well, there's certainly part of that's valid. That's basically Ricardo's theory of rent. And as you do get population growing, then people who've bought in the inner city are going to see their prices rise. And what they're benefiting from, the increase that's happening has got bugger all to do with their own contributions. They simply bought land in the right place, and then social expansion caused it. So this is where the Georgians come along and say, well, that is actually not something that the individual created. So that should be taxed as a land tax to stop that accumulating in private hands. But we don't do that, of course. And so consequently, that is a source of profit for those people. But that only works so long as people buying that land take on more debt than you've done. And that's the catch, because it works for a while, but if it was all entirely on non-borrowed money, there'd never be a problem. Okay, the prices would rise, but the ceiling would be set by income and servicing of income. Because you borrow money to buy housing, and that's a rubber band in many ways. It starts off back in the 60s and 70s, where bank managers, my father was a bank manager, expect you to have a 30% deposit to buy a property. Well, I don't need to tell you guys about 95% and even 120% loan to valuation offers. That means you everything, including the deposit, and then enough to furnish the place and buy a spa for the backyard.
120%.
So I've literally seen those around. So consequently, they're just that huge increase. But then, of course, that if you're relying upon going from 70% to 80 to 85 to 90 to 95 to 100, 110, 120, etc.
That's a fucking worry.
There's a point where you simply, the amount of debt, first of all, to get on the ladder in the first place is going to cost you a fortune. And so people get older and older. So what you're doing is you're reducing the number of people who've got the income to save the deposit in the first place. So you're reducing your pool that way. And then the level of leverage that they're taking on is all just justified by expecting the prices are going to continue rising forever. Well, Australia's had a pretty good record of maintaining it, but it's the only country, well, it in Canada, are the only countries that have done that for a sustained period. All the others have ultimately fallen over.
Nice. And so you said that I guess the warning sign is when credit slows, the change in debt. And so you said that can either come from when the banks stop lending or when people stop borrowing. What do you think comes first? Which is more likely?
It's often the fragility of the financial system is something which people don't actually have their heads around, because a bank has to have positive equity, a private bank. It has to have assets greater than liabilities. If it has, and particularly talking short-term versus long-term, but in general, if its liabilities exceed its assets, it's got negative equity and therefore it's bankrupt. Now, its assets, if its assets are based on things like shares, property that it owns itself and so on, if there's a crunch in the value of those properties, then banks can go very rapidly from positive equity to negative equity, which is why they're desperate to borrow money, because they borrow the money and put that on their equity side, and they manage, for a short while to be solvent once more. So often these things can come completely out of the blue, because, some of the banks, apparently I've been told some small banks are trading on a price to earnings ratio of 250 to 1. And things like that. Well, it doesn't take much to make that fall over. So normally when you have the level of leverage you've got now, it tends to be an unexpected financial collapse of some institution. My favourite example there is a mate of mine was a hedge manager in Boston, and he used to go on regular tours of banking institutions throughout the world, and he found himself in northern Finland, and he was asking who's the main competition you have for deposits up here, and the answer was Northern Rock. And he said he got off the plane back in Boston, and his underlings asked him, what have you learned from the trip? He said, short Northern Rock. Well,
unreal.
He did rather well out of that. So it's because this fragility, as they lever up, they're dependent upon us. Just like individuals are dependent upon house prices continuing to rise, banks themselves become dependent upon asset prices continuing to rise. But they're much more fragile, because if a bank gets negative equity, that's goodbye. Whereas virtually, if you didn't have government money, the rest of the economy would always have negative equity. And this is a point most people don't get. If your assets, somebody's asset is somebody else's liability, okay, and assets minus liabilities equals equity. If banks have to have positive equity, and there wasn't government money or foreign trade in there as well, then the sum of the rest of the economy would have negative equity.
Sure.
That's quite okay for non-banks to function that way, but not for banks. So it tends to be the banks that, when they suddenly join the rest of us with negative equity, that's when it falls over.
Nice. And if if a crash comes and people are thinking either they're holding on to speculative assets or they're wanting to get into them, so I don't know, maybe we've talked a little bit about property, but either maybe your precious metals, your gold and silver, your cryptocurrencies, stocks, foreign currencies. What if people are holding these or looking to get into them, what would your advice be?
I mean, when you have a crisis caused by a private debt bubble bursting, then virtually all assets fall in value. Okay, they're all coordinated, because this is one thing mainstream economics has completely misled us on, as they argue there's no link between leverage and asset prices. That's total bullshit.
Yeah.
The empirical data just screamingly contradicts that, but that's the belief system they have. So if you have a fallover, if debt starts to fall or credit starts to fall, then asset prices collapse, and it's across the board. The only thing which is you're likely to get some leverage out of is that when that happens, bond prices are likely to go in opposite direction to shares, but that's about it. So as shares are likely to fall, house prices fall, and so on. And even gold is what will happen with gold and maybe cryptocurrencies is that they're not money, but they're a haven people move into when there's a crisis. So in that case, that makes them potentially sensible to be in.
So gold's a good one.
Yeah, I have so many gold bugs at me, it pisses me off. But because they think gold is money, it's not. But it's a speculative commodity that does well during financial crises.
And Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, why are they no good at the moment, you think, if something goes
wrong? They're too volatile. And it takes too long to settle. I mean, I know that there are various technologies that are trying to get around this, but Bitcoin was based on an analogy to gold. You're supposed to mine this stuff. It takes energy to mine it. And the energy's risen as the stock of Bitcoins has been exploited. And it takes 10 minutes to verify a transaction. You can't have that. The advantage of a centralised system is as soon as you swipe your card, the money's transferred from your account, from your account to the purchase, to the seller's account. So you need something as fast as that. And the idea that it's possible to combine blockchain with centralised transactions. The whole idea that it has to be decentralised is a sort of libertarian interpretation of what money is.
An anti-government sort of. I don't want big institutions' hands in it. So, is the only way out? We're in this tough situation. Australia's 213% private debt to GDP, and the other zombies to be high ratios there. Is the only way out a crash? Is there any way out to?
Well, the way you could get out is because the government is a way of creating money, fundamentally by accounting. Pardon me. Just as my cold getting in the way, just as the banks create money by double entry bookkeeping, so does the government. But the big difference, and I'm delighted to say, one of my friends at the Bank of England has published a little online statement, not the paper yet, the guy called David Bolat, just recently published a point saying the central bank is the only bank that operates with negative equity. Okay. Because it doesn't matter. I mean, you accept they create the money. If they put it in your account, you're not going to say you haven't got any equity, I'm not going to accept this money. So consequently, they've got more flexibility that way. And if they wanted, as they're doing with QE, they've created, in England's case, £200 billion a year worth of money to create, and that's just out of double entry bookkeeping. Now, they could have done exactly the same thing with the private sector. They didn't have to do it through the financial sector. So my concept is what I call a modern debt jubilee. But I'm elaborating on it over time. What I realised is that what I wanted to have was the government create the money and put the money into people's private bank accounts. And then people who had debt, the debt would be paid down. People who didn't have debt would get a cash injection. Now, that's so you don't benefit people who speculated for those who didn't. But also, what about the level of corporate debt? And also, what about the level of inequality? Well, another potential trick you could use is to say that people who get that cash injection have to use it buying shares from companies, which the companies themselves have to use to cancel their debt. So what you could do is have a dramatic increase in equity, and you could do it on a per capita basis. It would be anybody with a bank account would get the same amount of money. So you'd get as much as Rupert Murdoch. And consequently what you get is a way of reversing some of the inequality, where the inequality itself has come out of the increased level of private debt.
I don't think anyone will be saying no to a nice injection into their bank account. But would that cause inflation if there's so much money? How old are you? I'm 26. I don't know much.
No. It's just amazing how much the scare of inflation has got into the psyche because 26. Okay, when you were born?
90.
90. Okay, that's when the inflation collapsed out of the economy. You probably by the time you were 2. By the time you were able to read, inflation was down to 1/3 of what it was at the peak level. But everybody, it's been pumped into the psyche. Inflation's really, really bad. Inflation got out of hand at the time, but it was due to a booming economy and a credit bubble. And what we've had with both of the growth of China bring a huge deflationary surge into the economy and an increase in the level of private debt. We actually want to reduce the level of private debt, and one way is to have inflation. The reason there wasn't a crisis back in the 70s and the 80s was because, as well, we had a debt bubble bursting back in both in the 70s and the 80s. But when it burst, inflation was so high that inflation reduced the level of private debt compared to GDP.
Yeah.
So it is a case, yes, you could cause inflation that way. That's why I said if I had the idea of share buying, it wouldn't cause any inflation at all.
Yeah.
Okay. So you could do some combination like that where you'd have, you don't want, the real danger for a debt deflation is that when people pay their debt down, to pay your debt down, you necessarily reduce the money in existence.
Yeah.
That's what Fisher called. He said the more the debtors pay, the more they owe. And I call that Fisher's paradox. And he's quite right. If you pay your debt down, you reduce money in circulation. When you reduce the money in circulation, you reduce GDP. So your debt ratio can remain almost constant, even though you've paid the debt down. And that happened a lot during the Great Depression, also in Europe in the last 5 or 10 years. So you want to have something that is going to mean demand is maintained when you go through this. And the idea of the modern debt jubilee would be providing cash inflows, so people would you wouldn't be eliminating money. You'd actually be creating money, but you'd be directing it to cancelling debt. So you'd have a change in the fiat to credit-based nature of the money supply, and you'd also democratise share ownership.
And is that so? So it goes through in one hit. Does that? I guess how long does that? What does that do?
I'd trial it. I mean, I definitely want to have because it's never been tried before. I mean, there've been. There's a guy who should research called Richard Vague. Richard is the least vague person I've ever met.
Unfortunate name.
But Richard established 2 of America's major credit card companies. And he won't tell me how much he's worth, but he's
a lot.
And he got worried about the level of mortgage debt that his customers had, and started asking economists about should he worry about it, and they gave him the usual stock standard answer: well, yes, their debts have risen, but their assets have risen as well, not a problem. And he finally sold one of his companies to Barclays in 2005, and of course the crash occurred. We became friends because he said he actually runs a book blog as well, and he goes through bookshops all the time. And he spotted my book with Debunking Economics, which immediately attracted his attention. He flicked it open and saw one of his own graphs staring back at him.
Nice.
So, but what he looking at it, he said that there have been about 150 financial crises around the world in the last 1.5 centuries, and the only way you got out of any of them is by debt write-offs. Okay? There have been a couple of instances like a huge export surge for a country like Saudi Arabia when prices rise and so on, but generally speaking, the vast majority of crises are solved by writing the debt off.
And in your book, there's another positive solution that you propose, and that's entrepreneurial equity loans, which sounded pretty good. Can you just tell us a little bit about that and how they could potentially work if the government took?
Yeah, well, there's one of the reasons that banks don't lend to entrepreneurs is most of them fail.
For sure.
You know, and so if a bank does lend to an entrepreneur, they get a debt charge against their assets. But if their assets collapse, you know, their debt's wiped out.
Exactly.
So there's a very strong disincentive. Whereas venture capitalists take an equity position in firms, and the idea is that they might lose on 3 or 4, but one of them's going to succeed big time. So they gain massively on the equity. We should combine venture capitalism with banking. That's the idea. But that would then, the thing is, again, as I've had some colleagues in the States say, most venture capitalists lose money. Okay. But the thing is, when banks are creating money for asset bubbles, in the fundamental sense, they're losing as well. Okay. So if you actually say, well, the creation of money by debt should really be also be creation by equity, and if there's some losses there, then that's part of the game. Because what you're trying to do is to use money to harness the creativity of humanity. And what we've done instead is treat money as the sacrosanct thing that can't be violated, when in fact the easiest thing in the world is to make money. It's really hard to make a profit or make a wage. Making money just involves double entry bookkeeping.
Nice. I guess what are some of the? I guess how is having the entrepreneurial equity loans, having the banks doing that as an alternative to the VCs? What's the? I guess what's the benefits of having the banks?
Well, see, with venture capitalists, they've got to raise their own money in the first place. So consequently, you don't have any money creation necessarily coming out of venture capital unless they lever up their position. So venture capitalists borrow from banks, and then they lend. Then that's the money creation, but it's indirect. And of course, the question is the venture capitalist going to be successful or not? If the banks could do it directly, and then a large part of bank operations involve writing off bad debt.
Yeah.
Okay. But they could equally write off bad equity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's one of Richard's proposals for getting out of the crisis is to enable banks to write debt off over a 30-year period, rather than having to take the entire charge in 1 year.
Yeah.
And that way there's less damage done to their equity than there would be if you do it in one hit. So there's a range of different ways to go about it, but the basic idea is just to realise that money creation is just double entry bookkeeping.
Mm-hmm.
They're not warehouses that have to really take good care of our money. They're factories that need to produce enough, but they should be producing it for good reasons. And because it's so simple to do, we should have it done for good reasons rather than bad.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it makes sense if you got 9 out of 10 fail, but hopefully that one goes more than 10x.
Yeah,
it works out.
Paradigm told us about a 3 to 4 1 ratio.
Yeah.
Okay, nice. I guess just to sort of slowly wrap it up, do you think is there hope? Is there hope that the system can change, or
no?
We're all fucked.
I mean, I've just seen. It's partly because I have such faith in people like Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, having known them at university, to fuck up. That there's no likelihood of somebody doing like a Roosevelt type thing, where Roosevelt, when he actually had the bank holidays, a huge part of that was writing off the debt, working out which were viable organisations, combining them together. That's real, engineering in the proper sense of the word, financial engineering. I can see us getting caught in the same trap Japan has been in for a quarter of a century now. And the only way I can see getting out of it is because we'll be forced to do something gigantic on the climate. And at that stage, nobody's going to worry about running up debt and bankrupting our children when the alternative is to cook them instead.
So I guess that's one thing we can probably focus on is like reviving our economy through, I guess, fighting against climate change. That might be one hope of a revolution.
Because you look at what happened. The reason we got out of the Great Depression was the Second World War. The reason we had the Second World War was the Great Depression. But what actually happened in England's case in particular is quite dramatic.
Yeah.
In the first year, 1940, the budget deficit in the UK was 40% of GDP.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're currently panicking about a deficit of 3.
Yeah.
Okay. But now, when you wanted to have 40% of GDP as your deficit level, was to build the Spitfires and the bombs and the guns and stuff to fight the Germans. Nobody said we can't afford that bomb.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
It's that we'd be saying Heil Hitler next,
exactly.
next year in the country. So when there's an existential threat, all this crap goes out the window, and people throw huge amounts of money into the system. And again, the same thing with climate change. It becomes existential. We just want to mobilise physical resources. They're the ones that are hard to produce. Mobilise and create them. And then in that case, bang, whatever happens on the monetary side, we do it and we cope with it later.
Nice. And so this book is pretty relatively new, I guess. What are the next projects in your world?
There's a comic book coming out.
A comic book?
Yeah, I've got this brilliant cartoonist called Gere. He has a thing called 7 Robots. And Miguel's wife, Susie, was reading Debunking Economics and sent me a photo of her reading on the New York subway. And we became friends that way. And he'd send me cartoons occasionally. They were literally Marvel comic standard. So we finally decided to get a Kickstarter campaign together to do a book on money. Unfortunately, the first 2 authors to try to write that didn't do a good job. So I finally had to say, okay, I've got to do it. So that's a future project. But in the meantime, by sheer accident, I've written 3 satires, and they're coming out as a comic book, which is called Econocracy, or Economics, C-O-N, an apology by the economists of the world to the planet.
Nice.
And the first one sends up Ricardo, which that's the preface. That's the preface to the book, so that's lightly illustrated. Another one is called The Reality Virus. Let's talk about economists being affected by reality. And the third one is sending up the secular stagnation argument that Summers and Krugman make about trying to explain why the crisis is continuing. So that should be coming out in about 2 months' time.
Yeah, unreal.
Nice.
I guess, so where can our audience find you if they want to learn more and stop listening to these other idiots who are in the mainstream?
The main thing is my Patreon page. Because now, like what I'm going to be doing, I mean, university's been screwed by 40 years of neoliberalism. And there's just particularly in England, they're trying to create an artificial market. And it's total waste of bloody time. But all these bureaucratic rules are just getting laid on top of universities. Funding has been reduced. Non-orthodox economists only get jobs at shitty universities. And of course, they're the ones which are vulnerable to any change in rules. I've had enough of it. So I'm going out and getting crowdfunding. And that's through a Patreon site. So patreon.com/ProfSteveKeen. Then I've got a website called Prof Steve Keen, which it's pretty undeveloped, but it's there. And my old debt deflation site is the main one.
Awesome.
Fantastic. I guess just as a bit of parting advice, what's a couple of sentences? What do we need to do to prepare for this impending crisis?
Well, and for individuals, don't be too highly levered. That's the thing. I mean, don't sell a place you enjoy living in if you can afford it. Okay, but if you've got speculative properties and you're worried, then getting the first person into the life raft tends to survive. So that's reasonable advice. But the other is, stop falling for all the myths of economics. That's the main because people believe government should run surpluses. That's actually believing government should destroy money. All this sort of stuff's made our situation worse rather than better.
Love it. I think that's a fantastic way to end.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good way to end.
Yeah.
Guys, for us, we think the world would be a better place if they just read books and stopped listening to some of that crap that's on the TV.
Mate, we like a few TV shows, but most of it is just a waste of time.
A lot of the news. So if you guys also believe in our vision and think the world would be a better place if people just read books, give us a review, and then more people find the podcast and more people start reading books.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Get some books into you.
Yeah.